The word hung in the tense air like a crack of thunder. Monkey. All eyes shifted toward the officer who had just said it, the smirk on his face dripping with mockery. Officer Greg Rollins leaned lazily against his patrol car, arms crossed over his chest as if daring the man standing across from him to react. The man, tall and composed, met Greg's gaze without blinking, his dark eyes cut through the insult like a blade. Everything about him, the sharp lines of his tailored suit, the shine of his polished shoes, set him apart on the crowded downtown street. He didn't belong here, but not for the reasons Greg assumed. "Did you just call me a monkey?" The man's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "I did." Greg's sneer deepened, his hand grazing the holster on his hip, as if to remind everyone who held the authority. "What are you going to do about it?" The man didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing down on the bystanders gathering nearby. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. His eyes stayed locked on Greg's, unwavering. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Greg laughed, the sound rough and grating, like nails scraping glass. "What, are you some hotshot lawyer? You think that suit scares me?" The man tilted his head just slightly, a faint smile flickering at the corners of his mouth. But before he could reply, a sharp voice pierced the air. "Greg!" Another officer hurried over, younger and visibly uneasy. His face was pale, his steps hesitant. "Maybe you should." "Shut it, rookie." Greg's bark cut him off, sharp and dismissive. The rookie swallowed his words and stepped back. Greg turned to the man in the suit again, his grin returning. "Go on, say whatever you've got to say, then get out of my sight." The man didn't flinch. He took another step forward, the crowd murmuring with anticipation. The street felt like it was holding its breath. "Let's just say," the man said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness, "you'll be seeing me again very soon." The words lingered like a storm cloud that hadn't yet broken. The weight of what had just happened wasn't fully realized, but it would be. Hours earlier, the day had begun on a different note. It started with the new police chief, Marcus Bennett, stepping into the department for the first time. Marcus was a man of integrity and quiet strength, but his journey to leadership had been anything but easy. At 44, he had climbed the ranks through perseverance, refusing to let the challenges of his identity or background define his path. As he entered the station that morning, the building buzzed with curiosity. Officers paused to glance his way. Some welcomed him with polite nods, while others whispered behind his back. Marcus caught the sideways glances, the raised eyebrows, the unspoken judgments. He moved through the hall with unshakable confidence, stopping to introduce himself to each officer he passed. He wasn't there to win favor, he was there to lead. Greg Rollins, however, wasn't in the station that morning. Had he been, things might have gone differently. Greg, a veteran officer with a reputation for towing the line, was out on patrol. Loud, brash, and unfiltered, Greg had a knack for stirring trouble. The news of a black man becoming police chief hadn't sat well with him, but he hadn't had the chance to voice his thoughts yet. Marcus spent his morning settling into his office, holding meetings with his senior staff. The tension in the air was thick, but Marcus had weathered worse. He was there to do the job, not ease discomfort. By midday, Marcus stepped out for a break. Walking the streets helped him reconnect with the community, a reminder of why he'd taken this position in the first place. That's when he crossed paths with Greg. Greg had pulled over a driver, a young black woman whose hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. Her wide eyes reflected fear as Greg's sharp tones sliced through the air. Marcus observed from a distance. His instincts told him to step in. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus's voice was steady as he approached. Greg barely spared him a glance. "Move along. Police business." "I'm aware," Marcus replied, stepping closer. "I asked if there's a problem." Finally, Greg turned to him fully, eyes narrowing. The suit threw him off. "Who the hell are you?" "Driver, are you all right, ma'am?" The young woman behind the wheel gave a hesitant nod, her eyes flickering nervously between the two men. Greg Rollins, annoyed by the interruption, stepped in front of Marcus Bennett, effectively blocking his view. "I told you to move along," Greg snapped, his voice rising slightly. "You interfering with an officer?" "No," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm just observing." Greg's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a smirk. "Observing, huh? What are you, one of those civil rights types?" Out here trying to play the hero. Marcus didn't react to the bait. His voice remained even. I'm here to make sure everyone is treated fairly. Greg's smirk twisted into something colder, sharper. Oh, I get it now. Another monkey sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. The words landed like a slap across the street. A hush fell over the crowd gathering along the sidewalk. Even Greg seemed to realize he'd gone too far. For a brief second, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, but instead of backing down, he straightened his shoulders, doubling down on the false confidence that had carried him this far. Marcus didn't flinch. His face gave away nothing, as if weighing the weight of Greg's insult carefully. Then, slowly, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Greg's eyes darted to it. What are you doing? His tone grew defensive. Marcus didn't bother answering. He finished typing, slid the phone back into his pocket, and gave Greg a faint smile. Like I said, Marcus murmured, you'll be seeing me again. Marcus turned and walked away, his calm composure standing in stark contrast to the bubbling tension he left behind. The crowd slowly began to scatter, murmurs lingering in the air. Greg stood rooted to the spot, seething. He hated the way that man had stripped him of his usual authority without lifting a finger. What the hell was that about? Greg muttered under his breath, glancing at his rookie partner, Officer Sean Davis. Sean hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced around nervously as if unsure anyone else had heard the exchange. Maybe you should let this one go, Greg, Sean mumbled. That guy didn't seem like someone to mess with. Greg scoffed loudly. Oh, come on, just another suit, trying to make a scene. You see the way he carried himself? Bet he's some wannabe activist lawyer. Hell, he'll probably cry to the media and say I profiled him or some nonsense. They're all the same. Sean didn't respond. He'd only been on the force for 6 months, and if he'd learned anything, it was to avoid challenging Greg directly. But something about that man in the suit unsettled him. He didn't seem like the loudmouth Greg thought he was. There was an air of quiet authority about him, something that didn't fit Greg's dismissive attitude. Meanwhile, Marcus returned to his car, still parked a few blocks away. Sliding into the driver's seat, he took a deep breath, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. He wasn't surprised by Greg's behavior. He'd dealt with officers like him before. That didn't make it easier to stomach. Pulling out his phone again, Marcus scrolled through his contacts, pausing when he reached a number labeled with a single star. He pressed call. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. Chief Bennett, the voice greeted him warmly. How's the first day treating you? Eventful. Marcus replied dryly. I need you to pull a file for me. Of course. What do you need? Officer Greg Rollins, Marcus said without hesitation. I want everything. Personnel records, complaint history, performance reviews, the works. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Understood. Anything specific you're looking for? Marcus stared out of the windshield for a moment, watching as the last of the crowd faded into the distance. I just had an interaction with him, Marcus said carefully. Let's just say he needs closer scrutiny. I'll get back to you soon, the voice replied. Marcus ended the call, fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. He wasn't angry, at least not yet. He'd long since learned how to channel frustration into something more useful. But he knew this wasn't the last time Greg Rollins would cross a line, and next time, the consequences would be harder to ignore. Back at the station, Greg strutted through the doors as if nothing had happened. He slapped a hand on Sean's shoulder as they walked down the corridor. Relax, rookie, Greg said with a grin. I've been at this a long time. Guys like that don't scare me. Sean gave a weak smile, but didn't respond. His silence wasn't lost on Greg, but he shrugged it off. As they passed the break room, Greg spotted a group of officers chatting by the coffee machine. With a self-satisfied smirk, Greg sauntered over. You guys should have seen it, Greg said loudly, drawing their attention. Some big shot in a suit thought he could tell me how to do my job, tried to intimidate me. Can you believe that? The laughter around Greg Rollins started to fade, replaced by sidelong glances and awkward shifts. His reputation was well known, and while some officers found him amusing, others weren't as impressed. Still, no one dared to challenge him. Greg thrived in that space, the unspoken rule that no one crossed him. As he continued to recount his exaggerated version of the morning's events, the atmosphere in the station shifted. Marcus Bennett had returned. Now dressed in full uniform, Marcus's badge caught the overhead lights, gleaming with quiet authority. His presence commanded immediate attention. Conversations stumbled to a halt as he moved through the room. Some officers straightened reflexively, others ducked their heads, suddenly engrossed in paperwork. The air seemed heavier with his arrival. Greg, oblivious to the shift, was mid-sentence when Marcus approached the group. "Officer Rollins," Marcus said evenly. Greg's grin froze. His eyes flicked toward Marcus, and his smirk faded as he recognized who was standing in front of him. The confusion on Greg's face was clear, but he masked it quickly, slipping back into his usual cocky bravado. "Yeah? Who's asking?" Greg's tone still carried a trace of defiance. Marcus didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained steady, letting the weight of the silence press down. Finally, he extended his hand. "Chief Marcus Bennett," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I believe we've already met." The room fell completely silent. Greg's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. His mind raced to catch up. "Wait." Greg's voice trailed off, his confidence visibly cracking. "You're the new chief?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth hung in the air, undeniable. A low hum of tension swept the room. Officers exchanged glances, and Greg's face paled slightly as the realization settled. Marcus leaned in just enough for his voice to reach only Greg. "We'll talk later," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Straightening, Marcus glanced around the room. "Carry on," he said, his tone commanding yet even. He walked away, his footsteps echoing through the now muted space. Conversations resumed gradually, but the buzz felt different, more hushed, more cautious. Greg remained frozen in place, staring at nothing, his bravado dissolving into a sinking sensation in his gut. Hours later, Greg found himself sitting alone in the locker room, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. He had successfully avoided Marcus for the remainder of the day, but he knew their conversation was inevitable. His mind raced through excuses, justifications, anything to explain away what had happened. None of it felt convincing. The locker room door creaked open, and Greg tensed instinctively. He didn't need to look up to know who had entered. "Officer Rollins," Marcus's voice came, calm yet unwavering. Greg glanced up, his face betraying a mix of guilt and defensiveness. "Chief," Greg said, forcing the word out. Marcus sat down on the bench across from him, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "We need to talk," Marcus said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. Greg swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how empty the room felt. A heavy silence stretched between them. Finally, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze pinning Greg in place. "Tell me, Greg," Marcus said quietly, "do you always call people monkeys? Or was today special?" The words hit like a hammer. Greg's face reddened, his mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Before he could formulate a response, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, then stood up, tucking the phone back into his pocket. "Enjoy your evening, Officer Rollins," Marcus said with a faint edge to his voice. "We'll finish this conversation tomorrow." He left without another word. Greg remained seated, staring at the empty doorway, the weight of Marcus's words settling like bricks in his chest. For the first time in years, Greg Rollins felt something new: regret. The following morning, Greg woke with a heavy head. Sleep had eluded him, and his thoughts churned endlessly through the night. He tried convincing himself he could handle whatever Marcus had in store for him, but deep down, he felt something unraveling. When he arrived at the station, the atmosphere felt different. Whispers followed him down the hall. Officers who usually greeted him with nods avoided his gaze. Even Davis, his rookie partner, kept his distance. Greg sat at his desk, pretending to focus on paperwork when his computer pinged with a new email. His eyes narrowed as he read the subject line. Meeting reminder. Chief Bennett's office, 10 a.m. Glancing at the clock, 9:56. Greg's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stand. Straightening his uniform, he strode toward Marcus's office, each step heavier than the last. When Greg entered, Marcus Bennett was already seated behind his desk, flipping through a file with a focused expression. He didn't look up as Greg knocked softly and stepped inside. "Close the door," Marcus said without lifting his eyes. Greg obeyed. The soft click of the door sounded louder than it should have in the quiet office. He hesitated, unsure whether to sit or stand at attention. His palms felt clammy as he shifted awkwardly. After a long pause, Marcus finally looked up, his gaze sharp and unreadable. "Have a seat, Officer Rollins," Marcus said, motioning toward the chair across from him. Greg hesitated before lowering himself into the chair, his posture stiff and rigid. He cleared his throat, trying to sound confident. "Chief, Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off before he could begin. "I'll speak first," Marcus said, his tone firm but not angry. There was no room for argument in his voice. Sliding the file across the desk, Marcus rested his hands on the surface and leaned back. Greg glanced at the file but didn't touch it. "I've reviewed your record," Marcus began, his voice calm yet deliberate. "You've been on the force for over a decade. Commendations for bravery, solid performance reviews from certain supervisors." Greg straightened slightly, grasping at the positive tone. "But," Marcus continued, his eyes narrowing, "there's another side to this file." Greg's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Excessive force," Marcus listed, flipping through the pages. "Unprofessional conduct, multiple allegations of discriminatory behavior." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. None of it resulted in formal disciplinary action, but the pattern is clear. "With all due respect, Chief," Greg interrupted, his voice firm, "those complaints were baseless. People make things up to avoid responsibility. You know how it is." Marcus raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Do I?" Greg faltered, realizing too late what he'd implied. Marcus leaned forward, his forearms resting on the desk, gaze piercing through Greg's thin defenses. "Let me be perfectly clear, Officer Rollins," Marcus said, his voice like steel. "Every time you put on that uniform, you represent this department. Your actions reflect on all of us. And yesterday, what you said to me, what you called me, was not only disrespectful, but it also showed a level of arrogance and ignorance that won't be tolerated here." Greg shifted, struggling to maintain eye contact. "I didn't know who you were," Greg mumbled defensively. "That doesn't make it any better," Marcus replied swiftly. His tone sharpened. "You didn't know I was your chief, so you felt comfortable treating me and anyone else you don't respect like that?" Marcus's eyes narrowed further. "Tell me, Greg, how many others have you spoken to that way? How many monkeys have you dealt with on patrol?" The words hit like a slap. Greg's face burned with shame, but he masked it with defiance. He opened his mouth, but Marcus wasn't finished. "You may have gotten away with this before," Marcus said, his voice steady, "but under my leadership, that ends now." Greg's shoulders tensed. "Are you saying you're out to get me?" Greg snapped. "No," Marcus replied, his tone cool. "I'm saying I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference." The room hung heavy with silence. Finally, Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his hands calmly. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said. "You'll attend mandatory sensitivity training. In addition, a full review of your conduct, past and present, will begin immediately. If there's evidence of misconduct, appropriate action will be taken." Greg's eyes widened. "You can't be serious," he blurted out. "Oh, I'm very serious," Marcus replied without missing a beat. "This is your chance to prove you can do better. Don't waste it." Greg shot to his feet, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is a witch hunt," Greg spat. "You're targeting me because you've got a chip on your shoulder." Marcus didn't rise to the bait. He stood slowly, locking eyes with Greg, his calmness unwavering. "You can believe whatever you want, Officer Rollins," Marcus said, his voice firm. "But I suggest you take a long, hard look at yourself. Because if you don't, your time here may be shorter than you think." Greg stormed out, slamming the door behind him. He stalked through the station, ignoring the curious glances that followed him. Let them stare. He didn't care what they thought. He was determined to prove he wasn't the problem. Later that day, Greg was assigned to patrol with Sean Davis. Sean fidgeted nervously in the passenger seat as Greg drove, tension thick between them. "You gonna say something, or just sit there squirming?" Greg barked, glancing sideways. Sean Davis hesitated, his voice uncertain. I think you should take what the chief said seriously." Greg Rollins let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, you're on his side now?" "It's not about sides," Sean replied quietly. "It's about doing the job right." Greg said nothing, his knuckles tightening around the steering wheel as they cruised through the neighborhood. The silence in the patrol car felt heavier than usual. Greg wasn't about to let a rookie or some new chief lecture him on how to do his job. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know how things really worked, and he wasn't about to change now. The shift passed uneventfully until a call crackled over the radio, a disturbance at Meadowbrook Park. When they arrived, a small group of teenagers stood by the basketball court, their raised voices echoing under the flickering streetlights. Greg stepped out, annoyance bubbling beneath the surface. "Hey," he barked. "Quiet it down." One of the teens, tall with dreadlocks hanging over his shoulders, took a step forward. "We're not doing anything wrong," the boy said, standing his ground. "Why are you hassling us?" Greg's eyes narrowed and his temper flared. "Watch your tone, kid," he snapped. "Unless you want to spend the night in a cell." The boy met Greg's gaze but said nothing. His jaw tightened, though his eyes stayed calm. From behind, Sean shifted nervously. He glanced at the tension rising between Greg and the teens. "Greg," Sean said softly, "maybe we should." "I've got this." Greg cut him off. Shooting him a glare, he turned back to the teens. "Break it up. Now." Reluctantly, the group began to disperse, though the boy with dreadlocks lingered for a moment. He held Greg's gaze with a silent defiance before finally walking away. Greg felt a flicker of satisfaction. He'd shown them who was in charge. But as they drove away, Sean couldn't shake the uneasy feeling sitting heavy in his chest. Greg's approach hadn't solved anything. It had only left a scar behind. Back at the station, Marcus Bennett sat in his office, reviewing the latest body cam footage. The park incident played on the screen, and Marcus's expression darkened as Greg's barked threats filled the room. "He hasn't learned a thing." Marcus leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The situation wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. Greg wasn't just an abrasive officer. He was quickly becoming a liability. Later that afternoon, Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at his door. "Come in," he said, closing the laptop as the door creaked open. Sean stepped inside, his expression uneasy. "Chief, can I speak with you?" Marcus gestured to the chair. "What's on your mind, Officer Davis?" Sean hesitated, his hands fidgeting slightly in his lap. "It's about Officer Rollins." Marcus's eyes sharpened, but he said nothing, letting the silence urge Sean to continue. "I've been patrolling with him for 6 months now," Sean began, his words slow and deliberate. "At first, I thought he was just old school, tough but fair. But lately, it's been different." Marcus's gaze stayed fixed on Sean. "He doesn't listen," Sean continued, his voice soft. "He escalates situations instead of calming them down. And yesterday," Sean trailed off, visibly uncomfortable. "Go on," Marcus prompted. Sean swallowed. "Yesterday, when he called you that word, it clicked for me. It's not just about how he treats suspects. It's how he sees people. He doesn't respect them. And that's dangerous." Marcus nodded slowly. "Thank you for bringing this to me," Marcus said, his tone steady. "It takes courage to speak up, especially about a fellow officer." Sean exhaled, relieved but still uneasy. "I just want to do the job right, Chief. I don't want to end up like him." "You won't," Marcus said firmly, "but changing the culture here will take work. It starts with accountability." Sean nodded and left the office, leaving Marcus to consider his next steps. That evening, Greg sat in his dimly lit apartment, nursing a beer in one hand and flipping through channels with the other. He tried to drown out the nagging feeling crawling under his skin, but it wouldn't leave him. Something's coming. Finally, he landed on the evening news. And in other local news, the anchor began. Sources inside the Westbridge Police Department suggest that newly appointed Chief Marcus Bennett is taking a hard stance on officer misconduct. Rumors of... Greg Rollins sat in his dimly lit living room, gripping a beer bottle tightly as the anchor's voice filled the space. Rumors of ongoing investigations within the Crest Hill Police Department have sparked debate about its future. More details to follow. Greg's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the glass. He felt cornered. The pressure that had been building for weeks was closing in. The next morning, Marcus called for a department-wide meeting. Officers filed into the briefing room, their conversations low and hushed. The tension in the air was palpable. Greg slouched in the back, arms folded tightly as Marcus stepped to the front, his calm yet commanding presence silencing the room. "Good morning," Marcus began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I called this meeting because it's time to address the standards we are expected to uphold as officers of this department." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We have a duty to serve and protect this community. Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. That means treating every citizen with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. Unfortunately, there have been instances where we've fallen short of that responsibility. A heavy silence filled the room. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others sat motionless, avoiding eye contact. Marcus's gaze swept over them, briefly lingering on Greg for just a moment. I won't name names, Marcus said, his voice firm but measured. But let me be clear, this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Accountability starts today. He proceeded to outline the department's new policies, mandatory sensitivity training, increased oversight of body cam footage, zero tolerance for discriminatory conduct. The room buzzed with murmurs. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Later, Greg stormed into the locker room, his frustration barely contained. A few of his usual allies lingered by the benches, and Greg wasted no time cornering them. Can you believe this? Greg hissed. He's trying to make us look like the problem, like we're the bad guys here. One officer, leaning against a locker, shrugged. Maybe you are the problem, Greg. The words hit harder than Greg expected. His scowl deepened, and without another word, he stormed out of the room. The feeling of control, the authority he once carried, was slipping through his fingers. Later that day, Greg responded to a routine call, a shoplifting incident at a small convenience store. When he arrived, the suspect, a young black man in his early 20s, was already being held by the store manager. The suspect looked nervous, his eyes darting to the floor. Greg approached with his usual gruffness. What'd he take? A sandwich, the manager replied, folding his arms. Didn't pay for it. I can't just let it slide. Greg's gaze fixed on the suspect. Got any money on you? The young man shook his head. I was hungry, he muttered. I didn't know what else to do. Greg's temper flared. That's not my problem. Hands behind your back. The man hesitated, glancing nervously at the sandwich on the counter. Please, officer, I'll leave. I won't come back. I said, hands behind your back, Greg barked, reaching for his cuffs. Before he could proceed, Sean Davis arrived as backup, stepping inside and taking in the scene. Sean's expression shifted immediately, and he moved between Greg and the suspect. Wait, Sean said calmly. Let's talk about this. Greg's eyes narrowed. There's nothing to talk about. He broke the law. Sean shook his head. He's stealing food because he's hungry. We can handle this without locking him up. Greg's jaw tightened. Since when do you call the shots? Sean didn't back down. Since we supposedly serve and protect. This isn't protecting anyone. The air crackled between them, neither man willing to budge. Finally, Greg took a step back, scowling. Fine, he muttered. Your call. Sean approached the suspect, resolving the situation without incident. The young man was let go with a warning, and Greg watched in silence, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. As they left the store, Greg's anger boiled over. You undermined me, Greg snarled. Don't ever do that again. Sean met his glare evenly. I did the right thing. Maybe you should try it sometime. Greg's hands curled into fists, but he said nothing. That evening, Marcus sat in his office reviewing the body cam footage from the store incident. His expression hardened as the video played. Greg's behavior had crossed yet another line. Marcus exhaled, then picked up his phone. Internal Affairs, he said after a moment. It's Chief Bennett. I need you to proceed with disciplinary action against Officer Rollins, effective immediately. The next morning, Greg's phone rang. He answered, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Officer Rollins, effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave, pending a formal review of your conduct. You are to report to the station at noon to surrender your badge and weapon. Greg Rollins sat up straight, gripping the phone tighter. What? This is a joke, right? His voice rose with disbelief. No, Officer Rollins, this is not a joke, Lieutenant Ramirez replied, her tone cold and unyielding. Failure to comply will result in further action. The line went dead before Greg could argue. His chest tightened, and a deep, simmering rage coiled in his gut. This was Marcus Bennett's doing. Greg had no doubt. When Greg arrived at Crest Hill Police Department later that morning, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officers avoided his gaze, and whispers followed him as he walked the hallway. Greg shoved open the door to Internal Affairs, where Ramirez and Marcus were waiting. Take a seat, Ramirez ordered curtly. Greg ignored the chair. His eyes locked on Marcus, fury flashing across his face. "This is your fault," Greg spat. "You've been after me since the day you got here." Marcus remained calm, his hands folded in front of him. "This isn't personal, Greg. It's about your actions." "My actions?" Greg snapped. "I've done my job for years, maybe not the way you like, but I've gotten results." Marcus's expression didn't waver. "And at what cost? Respect? Trust? This department's reputation? We're here to serve the community, not alienate them." Greg scoffed. "Spare me the speech. You don't care about this department. You're just here to push your own agenda." Before the tension could escalate, Ramirez stepped between them. "Officer Rollins," she said firmly, "this isn't a debate. Surrender your badge and weapon, now." Greg's glare shifted between the two of them. Finally, with a sneer, he unhooked his badge and holster, slamming them onto Ramirez's desk. "This isn't over," he growled before storming out. The fallout was immediate. The station buzzed with conversation. Some officers quietly supported Marcus's decision, while others whispered that he was being too harsh. The divide was clear, but Marcus didn't flinch. He knew this was bigger than Greg Rollins. This was about setting a precedent for the entire department. That afternoon, Marcus left the station and drove to the Crest Hill Community Center. He had arranged a meeting with local leaders, activists, clergy, and residents, hoping to rebuild the fractured trust between the department and the neighborhoods it served. As he entered the community room, the tension was unmistakable. The faces staring back at him wore expressions of skepticism and weariness, many shaped by years of mistrust. Marcus introduced himself and listened as one by one, community members voiced their concerns. An older woman named Mrs. Robinson stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "We used to call the police when we needed help," she said, her eyes glassy. "Now we're too afraid. My grandson won't even walk to the corner store without worrying he'll be stopped or worse." Marcus nodded solemnly. "I can't undo the past," he replied. "But I can promise you this. Everything in my power will be done to make sure this department earns your trust again. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen." Some in the room nodded in quiet approval, though skepticism lingered. As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus exchanged contact information with several attendees, vowing to maintain communication and collaborate moving forward. Meanwhile, Greg sat alone in his apartment, the bitterness gnawing at him. His phone vibrated with messages from a handful of sympathetic officers, but the support felt hollow. He turned on the TV, hoping to distract himself. His jaw clenched when the evening news flashed across the screen. Today, Crest Hill Police Chief Marcus Bennett met with community leaders to discuss efforts to reform the department. Sources indicate Bennett has already begun addressing officer misconduct, including the recent suspension of a veteran officer. Greg's grip tightened on the remote. In a flash of anger, he hurled it at the wall. The plastic cracked, pieces scattering across the floor. He couldn't stand it. Marcus was being praised while Greg was vilified. Greg grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His finger hesitated over a name he hadn't called in months. He hit the dial button. "Yeah, it's me," Greg said when the line connected. "I need a favor." The next morning, Marcus sat at his desk, sipping coffee as he scanned his inbox. A new email from Ramirez caught his attention. He opened it and scanned the contents, a detailed summary of the internal investigation into Greg Rollins. The investigation into Greg Rollins painted a damning picture. The report Ramirez handed over wasn't light reading. Body cam footage, complaints, and even statements from fellow officers all pointed to a clear pattern of abuse and misconduct. Marcus Bennett spent the better part of the morning drafting a formal report to the Crest Hill City Council. In it, he outlined his findings and the measures he intended to take to address the issues. Marcus knew this wouldn't be the last he'd hear of it. Greg wasn't the type to go quietly, and Marcus fully expected him to fight back. But Marcus was ready. As he finalized the report, a soft knock sounded at his office door. "Chief Bennett, you have a visitor," his assistant said hesitantly. Marcus glanced up. "Who is it?" "It's Mrs. Robinson," she replied, lowering her voice. "She says it's urgent." Marcus frowned but nodded. "Send her in." Mrs. Robinson entered, her hands wringing nervously. Her face was tight with worry, the kind Marcus had seen too often. "Chief Bennett," she began, her voice trembling, "something's happened to my grandson." Marcus's stomach tightened. What happened? He was walking home last night. A couple of officers stopped him, said he looked suspicious, she said, struggling to keep her composure. He's in the hospital now. They roughed him up, but he says he didn't do anything wrong. Marcus grabbed his coat and followed her to the hospital without hesitation. In the emergency room, Marcus's eyes immediately locked on Greg Robinson, lying in bed with a swollen eye, bruises along his arms, and a split lip. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He pulled up a chair beside the bed, his tone soft but serious. "Greg," Marcus said, leaning forward, "I'm Chief Bennett. I'm here to find out what happened." Greg hesitated, glancing at his grandmother before meeting Marcus's gaze. His voice was shaky but steady. "I was just walking home from the basketball courts," Greg said. "It was late, but I wasn't doing anything wrong." Two cops pulled up and started asking questions. "What kind of questions?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but focused. "They wanted to know why I was out so late, where I was going, if I had drugs on me," Greg said, his eyes glistening. "I told them I didn't have anything, but they didn't believe me. One of them grabbed me, pushed me against the car. I didn't fight back, I swear." Marcus's clenched beneath the table. "Did you catch their names or badge numbers?" Greg hesitated. "No, but one of them had a scar on his chin. He kept saying things like, 'Kids like you need to learn respect.'" Marcus felt his heart sink. He already knew who it was. He placed a reassuring hand on Greg's shoulder. "I'm going to look into this," Marcus promised. "You didn't deserve this." In the hallway, Mrs. Robinson was waiting, her face lined with concern. "Chief," she said quietly, "is it true? Are you suspending officers who step out of line?" Marcus nodded. "I am, and if I find out who did this, they'll face consequences." Mrs. Robinson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good, because this isn't the first time I've heard stories like this, but it needs to be the last." Back at the station, Marcus wasted no time calling an emergency meeting with Ramirez and the internal affairs team. He relayed Greg's story, ordering a full review of all patrol officers who were on duty the night before. "Start with Greg Rollins," Marcus said firmly. "He's suspended, but I want to confirm he wasn't involved." Ramirez nodded. "Understood. I'll pull the GPS logs from all patrol cars. If Greg can identify the officers, we'll narrow it down." As the investigation progressed, Marcus couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Greg Rollins's shadow still lingered. The scar on the officer's chin matched one of Rollins's closest friends, Officer Tim Givens. Givens had made no secret of his disapproval of Marcus's leadership. His record wasn't clean either. The following day, Ramirez returned with initial findings. The GPS data places Givens's patrol car in the area at the time Greg Robinson was stopped, Ramirez said. Marcus's expression darkened. "There's more," Ramirez continued, handing him a tablet. Bodycam footage shows Givens and his partner questioning Greg aggressively. The physical contact happened off camera, but there's no doubt it escalated. Marcus's eyes stayed fixed on the footage as Greg was shoved against the patrol car. But then something else caught Marcus's attention. After the incident, Givens made a phone call. The audio wasn't entirely clear, but Marcus could make out the intent. He was reporting to someone. Marcus Bennett played the clip on repeat, each viewing deepening the knot in his stomach. The muffled words from Officer Tim Givens's bodycam footage were enough to raise suspicions. But Marcus needed more than a hunch. He suspected who Givens had called, but proof was necessary. Meanwhile, Greg Rollins sat in a diner on the outskirts of Crest Hill, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The diner was quiet, almost empty, mirroring the isolation he felt since his suspension. The department he had served for years now seemed distant, like they had cast him aside. But Greg wasn't out of options. Givens had assured him that he was handling things, and Greg clung to the hope that meant applying pressure on Marcus. As Greg took another sip, his phone vibrated against the table. A text from Givens flashed on the screen. "We've got a problem. Call me." Greg immediately stepped outside, pacing as he dialed. "What's going on?" Greg asked, his voice low. Givens's tense voice answered. "Internal Affairs is sniffing around. They're asking questions about the kid from last night. Bennett's all over this." Greg's grip on the phone tightened. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet," Givens replied. "But the footage doesn't look good. They're closing in, Greg. We could get pinned for this." Greg swore under his breath. "You didn't mention my name, did you?" Of course not, Givens said, though his voice carried hesitation. But they're not stupid, Greg. They'll figure it out sooner or later. Greg's mind raced. If Givens folded under pressure, everything would unravel. Greg couldn't let that happen. He needed to act, and fast. At the station, Marcus's phone rang. "Chief," Ramirez's voice said on the other end, "we've got confirmation." Givens was one of the officers involved in stopping Greg Robinson. Marcus's grip on the receiver tightened. "And?" "We pulled the body cam footage," Ramirez continued. "It shows Givens and his partner questioning Greg aggressively, pushing him against the patrol car. But there's more. Afterward, Givens made a call. It wasn't entirely clear, but based on the timing, he called Greg Rollins." Marcus exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "What about the other officer?" "His partner appears clean. From what we can tell, Givens led the interaction." Marcus leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the desk. This wasn't just about Givens or Rollins anymore. This was about uprooting a culture that had allowed this kind of behavior to fester. "Bring them both in," Marcus said, his tone sharp. "I want to hear their explanations firsthand." That afternoon, Greg's phone buzzed again. "Officer Rollins," Ramirez's voice greeted him, cool and distant. "We need you to come in for questioning regarding an ongoing investigation." Greg's heart sank. "Do I have a choice?" he asked bitterly. "No," Ramirez replied. "Be here by 3 p.m. Greg hung up without another word, his pulse quickening. At exactly 3, Greg walked into the station, his face a mask of defiance. Whispers trailed behind him as he made his way toward the interrogation room, but Greg kept his head high, forcing himself to appear unfazed. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let anyone see him sweat. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. Inside the room, Ramirez and Marcus waited, the tension palpable as Greg sat down stiffly across from them. "Officer Rollins," Ramirez began, her tone clipped and professional. "This is a formal inquiry into your potential involvement in the unlawful detention and assault of Greg Robinson." Greg's eyes narrowed. "I wasn't even on duty that night," he replied. "That's true," Ramirez acknowledged, "but we have evidence that Officer Givens contacted you shortly after the incident. Care to explain?" Greg's pulse quickened. "Givens is a friend," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "He calls me all the time. That doesn't mean I had anything to do with it." Marcus leaned forward, locking eyes with Greg. "Did you know what he did?" Marcus asked, his voice low and piercing. "Did he tell you about stopping Greg Robinson?" Greg met Marcus's gaze, refusing to blink. "I didn't know anything about it," Greg said. "Whatever Givens did, that's on him." Ramirez slid a transcript across the table. "This is from Givens's body cam," she said. "The audio picks up a phone call right after the incident. He said, 'Don't worry, I've got this handled.' He was talking to you, wasn't he?" Greg's stomach churned. His eyes flicked to the transcript, but he stayed silent. Marcus's voice cut through the stillness. "The culture in this department is changing, Greg. If you were part of the old guard, if you encouraged this, know that it won't be ignored. You have one chance to come clean." Greg's fists curled beneath the table. He felt trapped. Every instinct told him to fight back, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit anything. "I didn't do anything wrong," Greg said through gritted teeth. The door opened suddenly, and Ramirez's assistant entered, handing over a file. Ramirez glanced at the contents and slid the folder toward Marcus, who opened it without speaking. Greg's stomach tightened as Marcus's eyes scanned the document, his expression unreadable. Marcus Bennett's eyes hardened as he flipped through the document Ramirez had just handed him. "This just came in," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "We pulled Givens's phone records. He called you 3 times after the incident. The last call lasted nearly 10 minutes. What were you discussing, Greg?" Greg Rollins's jaw tightened. "We talk about a lot of things. Doesn't mean I had anything to do with that kid." Marcus leaned back, studying Greg carefully. "You're not helping yourself here, Greg. The evidence is stacking up, and Givens won't take the fall alone. He'll talk if it means saving himself." Greg's heart sank. He knew Tim Givens wasn't loyal, especially under pressure. If Givens cracked, everything would fall apart. But admitting involvement meant handing Marcus exactly what he wanted. Greg wasn't ready to do that. "I'm done talking," Greg said abruptly, standing. "If you've got something on me, charge me. Otherwise, I'm leaving." Ramirez's expression remained cool. "You're free to go, for now." Greg stormed out, his blood boiling. As he walked through the station, he felt the walls closing in. But giving up wasn't an option. After Greg left, Marcus and Ramirez sat in silence, reviewing the case. The evidence was solid, but not enough to tie directly to the assault on Greg Robinson. They needed Givens to confirm his role. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in his office, contemplating his next move when a knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Sean Davis entered, shifting uneasily. "Chief, can I speak with you?" Marcus gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Officer Davis?" Sean hesitated, glancing at the door before lowering his voice. "It's about Greg. I know I shouldn't be talking about this, but I think he's in deeper than he's letting on." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "What makes you say that?" Sean glanced down at his hands. "I've overheard him and Givens talking. They're always complaining about how you run things, saying you're soft, how the department was better before you got here. Yesterday in the locker room, I heard Greg telling Givens not to drag him into this." Sean paused. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Thank you for telling me this, Davis. It's important that we hold everyone accountable." Sean hesitated. "Do you think any of this will really change things, Chief?" "Greg's been here forever. People look up to him." Marcus's expression softened. "Change isn't easy, Davis, but it starts with accountability. If we let this slide, we're telling the community their trust doesn't matter, and I won't let that happen." That night, Greg Rollins met Tim Givens at a bar on the edge of town. The two men sat in a corner booth, their voices low. "They're coming for me," Greg muttered, swirling the drink in his hand, "and if they get me, they'll come for you next." Givens frowned, nursing his beer. "What do you want me to do, Greg? They've got footage. They've got the phone records. I can't deny it happened." Greg leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "You keep your mouth shut, Tim. That's what you do. If you roll over, they'll bury both of us." Givens looked uneasy, shifting in his seat. "I don't know, man. Bennett's not like the others. He doesn't back down." Greg's fist slammed onto the table, drawing a few glances from nearby patrons. "You let me handle Bennett," Greg growled. "Just don't do anything stupid." Greg's options were running thin, but he wasn't about to let Marcus win. This had become personal. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the station early. He was already deep in thought about the case when he heard a voice behind him. "Chief?" Marcus turned to see Greg leaning against his car, arms crossed. A smirk played on Greg's lips, but his eyes held something closer to desperation. "Greg," Marcus said evenly, stopping a few feet away. "What are you doing here? You're on leave." Greg pushed himself off the car and stepped closer. "I wanted to talk," Greg said, his voice casual but forced. "Man to man." Marcus's jaw tightened. After a pause, he nodded. "Talk then." Greg lowered his voice. "You don't need to ruin both our careers over this. You back off. I back off. We both walk away clean." Marcus Bennett raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be an offer or a threat?" Greg Rollins' eyes narrowed. "It's common sense," he said, his tone sharp. "You've got people in this department who don't like you, Bennett. They don't trust you. You take me down, you're proving them right. You're making enemies you don't need." Marcus didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "Greg, the only person ruining your career is you. I didn't make you call me a monkey. I didn't make you ignore protocol, and I sure as hell didn't make you drag Givens into this mess." Greg's face flushed. His smirk faded and his confidence wavered. "I've done this job for 15 years. Greg snapped. "I know how to handle kids like Greg Robinson. You don't." Marcus's gaze hardened. "You mean black kids, poor kids, people you think are beneath you?" Greg opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus cut him off. "You've had years to fix how you handle things, Greg. Years to do better, but instead, you chose arrogance over accountability. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Greg's fist clenched at his sides, his body trembling with rage. But he couldn't bring himself to speak. With a sharp turn, Greg stalked away, muttering under his breath. Inside the station, Ramirez waited for Marcus, her expression unreadable. "We've got Givens," she said. "He cracked this morning, admitted Greg was the one who pushed him to stop Greg Robinson and rough him up." Marcus nodded. "Good. Prepare the full report for the city council and the district attorney. I want them to understand exactly what we're dealing with." By the end of the day, Greg's suspension became a termination. Tim Givens was formally charged with assault, and an internal investigation into past complaints against both officers began. The announcement sent shockwaves through the department. Some officers grumbled, but the message was clear. The days of unchecked misconduct were over. 2 weeks later, Marcus returned to the Crest Hill Community Center, where he had first met Greg Robinson and Mrs. Robinson. This time, he brought news. "The officers involved in Greg's case have been removed from the force," Marcus told the room of gathered residents. "One of them is facing criminal charges, and we're working to make sure this doesn't happen again." Mrs. Robinson's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Chief. I didn't think anyone would listen." Marcus smiled gently. "You deserve to be heard, Mrs. Robinson, and Greg deserves to feel safe in his own neighborhood." As the meeting continued, Marcus felt a rare sense of hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one he was ready to walk. Meanwhile, Greg Rollins sat alone in his apartment, the weight of his choices settling over him like a storm cloud. No job, no allies. For the first time in years, there was no one left to blame but himself. Months later, the department began rebuilding its relationship with the community. New training programs were introduced, complaints were addressed with urgency, and officers like Sean Davis became symbols of the positive shift Marcus had fought to implement. Greg Robinson, now healed from his injuries, returned to the basketball courts without fear. One afternoon, Marcus stood at the sidelines, watching as Greg laughed with his friends. It was a small moment, but for Marcus, it represented everything he had worked for.